What killed the dinosaurs? The Ice Age!
Ice-type Pokemon are pretty cool, but you know who's cooler? Frieza's brother. Compared to most other types, Ice's intended design identity is as clear as glass. Ice is the glass cannon archetype of the Pokemon type system, something which is obvious from a single glance at its type interactions. Offensively, the type is ice-cold lethal, hitting 4 types super effectively, 2 of them being particularly common types and the 4th being the exclusive dragon type. Notably, this is Dragon's only weakness apart from itself, making this type the designated Dragon Slayer for much of the franchise's early life. It's only resisted by 3 types too, with one being itself, making ice attacks easy to spam for high damage, especially if you use Freeze Dry, which converts water's ice resistance into a weakness. I think it's the only move in the game with that sort of weakness conversion property. And that's in the modern day. Back when Pokemon was first created, ice attacks in Gen 1 were only resisted by 2 types, being water and ice itself. Fire's ice resistance only got added in Gen 2, meaning it used to be even better offensively. However, the trade-off for such amazing offensive prowess is that defensively, ice is cooked. It only resists itself, nothing else, and 3 types hit it super effectively. Ouch. Anyone who's ever played a video game before can immediately tell what this type is all about. Hit stuff really hard and instantly shatter if you do actually get hit. It fits the glass cannon archetype's textbook definition perfectly. I haven't seen a cannon this perfect since the Neil Armstrong Cyclone Jet Armstrong cannon. It's really perfect. However, historically, Ice has always been the potential man of the type system, always teetering on the verge of greatness but consistently falling just a bit short. To begin, we need to talk about the glass cannon archetype itself. Specifically, we need to talk about 2 of its key design limitations. Firstly, the glass cannon is an advanced concept. It is something which should usually be introduced to players at a medium to late stage of the game, not an early one. This is because glass cannons tend to be extremely punishing for the new player experience. Their poor defenses punish a player extremely hard for whatever mistakes they make. And as a new player, you will fumble about and make mistakes extremely often as you gradually learn how the game's systems and mechanics work. Likewise, their strength of high damage output might not matter much at such an early point of the game, since enemies are likely still weak and go down easy to a few hits. Glass cannons can also train bad player habits. Most players will instinctively gravitate towards characters that can deal the highest DPS possible, so introducing a character which outputs more damage than other options early on can cause players to develop tunnel vision and focus all their resources and attention on that character instead of building a more well-rounded, versatile option. This can result in a snowballing effect where the player blasts through the early game, failing to build a diverse roster or learn anything about the game's mechanics in the process, which leaves them poorly equipped for later stages of the game. Or alternatively, the glass cannon underperforms and a player discards them, forgetting about them even as the game advances and reaches a point where the player gains the tools needed to properly utilize the character. This is why Ice-type Pokemon and Specialist Trainers are always encountered at a late stage of every game, typically being around the 7th or 8th badge or Elite Four. Their comparatively higher skill requirement to use compared to other types makes them difficult for new players to use. This lateness results in a small pool of Ice Pokemon. With only 65 Pokemon in existence, Ice is the rarest type, even rarer than snow in a desert. Yes, we have managed to obtain more Fairy Pokemon within the span of 3 generations than Ice Pokemon within 9. Of course, there are exceptions to that late game only rule. In Black and White, you could catch Vanillite at Driftvale City, the site of the 5th gym, and in Shield, Melanie is the 6th gym leader you battle. Granted, both of these cases are still past the halfway point of their respective game. The real outlier is X and Y, which lets you get Amora by the second gym, who proceeds to demonstrate my previous point perfectly because Amora effectively dies to everything and is almost useless at that stage of the game. As a designer, you should always tread lightly with the glass cannon archetype. As a general rule, a player should best get introduced to a concept or mechanic at the appropriate time for the game when they need to use it. Secondly, the glass cannon is potentially game-breaking. Out of all the standard game character archetypes that exist, the glass cannon has the greatest potential to break a game's balance in half. Typically, games are constructed around metrics, an arbitrarily chosen series of fixed values which get used as a benchmark unit of measurement. They could be based on something like an existing game object, or a measurable concept, or the player's own attacks. Two of the most common purposes for metrics are in building distances and calculating damage. The former is interesting, but it is a game design topic best saved for another time. It is the latter which is relevant to this discussion. Let's do some theoretical math. Say you have an RPG boss. They have 100 HP and your level 1 character attacks with a basic 3-hit combo which deals 1, 2, 5 damage. How many full turns does it take to kill the boss? Shouldn't be difficult, you'll kill the boss in 12.5 turns. And from playtesting, conclude that the fight took approximately 7 minutes, not including animations and cutscenes. Simple. Now let's scale up. You estimate that the player will be level 50 at this stage of the game. Their 3-hit combo now deals 320, 480 and 640 damage. And they've now gained several new skills which deal varying degrees of damage, cost varying amounts of mana, and can inflict statuses. Oh, and there's also things like gear and party members too. And this doesn't take into consideration how much damage the boss itself deals or what mechanics the boss fight involves. Now, assuming you do not take animations and cutscenes into consideration, how much HP do you believe the boss should have? This is why that one strategy RPG was such a headache to work on. The reality is that the final number itself is not important. What's actually important is the reason why you chose that number. See, when games add too many factors which obfuscate their damage calculations like this, trying to perform any sort of accurate forecasting is almost impossible. You just break your brain staring at calculations in Excel until you go crazy, and the number would still be wrong anyway. Having metrics helps you simplify this mess of numbers and variables into something more quantifiable, such as the number of turns or total session time. You can set an initial estimate goal and then you calculate the final health number to match that target estimate. The number will probably still need a lot of upward or downward adjustment after you playtest it. There's a high chance you'd have over or underestimated a player's capabilities. But at least it serves as a useful starting estimate, one much more reliable than just pulling a random number out of thin air. Naturally, metrics calculations can get more complicated, especially with more factors. But this simplified explanation should get the point across. Metrics like these are based on estimates of averages, situations and numbers which an average player is predicted to have. Statistical outliers are usually not taken into consideration for estimates, or else you'd be there forever. This is why the glass cannon archetype potentially screws with all of this, because the very premise of a glass cannon is to be a statistical outlier. It takes the 25 full combo estimate and potentially alters it to 5 full combos, assuming the player doesn't get hit, letting them potentially trivialize certain challenges in unintended ways. Enemies or bosses which you'd anticipate a player not being able to overcome at that point could potentially get nuked out of existence, granting players access to optional rewards far earlier than intended. Or boss patterns which should be more difficult can get cheesed due to the excess damage. While this can potentially happen with the opposite type of statistical outlier, the stone wall, due to being unkillable, that is less likely to be problematic, because not enough damage may be done fun to progress the fight, and some games tie survivability to mechanics rather than stats. This is why the glass cannon concept of the ice type needed to be handled with delicate care back in Gen 1. With all those super effective advantages, Ice Stab had the potential to offensively break the game if not balanced carefully. So the game developers handled this by not actually giving them high offense stats. Setting aside the legendary Articuno, because all 3 legendary birds were purposely overpowered and shared the same 125 special stat, Gen 1 had 4 other ice types. 3 of them had a 95 special stat, and the 4th, Cloyster, only had 85 special. It seems that 95 was the general limit of what Game Freak was allowing the Glass Cannon class to do at the time. A high number certainly, but when compared to powerhouses like Machamp and Rhydon, who had 130 attack, or Alakazam and Executor, who had 125 special, ice types looked kinda lukewarm in comparison. Of course, in practice, that stat didn't matter much. The real danger of ice types came from their associated status, Freeze. To anyone familiar with Gen 1 competitive history, this is the proverbial woolly mammoth in the room. Freeze was what made the ice type truly dangerous. During Generation 1, a frozen Pokemon never thaws. It just sits there, in a block of ice, until the sweet release of death claims it. Or until you go to the nearest Pokemon Center at least. The only way to thaw out was to be hit by a fire attack, which was realistically never going to happen because why would anyone do that? Freeze effectively made every Ice-type Pokemon unwallable and outright lethal to stay in prolonged combat with for an extended period of time. Sure, Psychic types had the edge in overall stats and Ground types had the almighty Earthquake, but you could still tank those if you were bulky enough. But if you tried to tank an Ice Beam, even if it dealt pitiful damage, you'd have a 10% chance to be removed from the fight entirely. Of course, Ice Beam and Ice Punch are merely side attractions. The real star of the show was Blizzard, whose original incarnation is the most overpowered move in all of Pokemon history. In the original Japanese release of Red and Green, Blizzard had 120 base power, 90% accuracy, and a 30% chance to freeze the target. This one single move just absolutely breaks all semblance of difficulty within the game. It not only has one of the highest base powers out of all moves, only losing to Hyper Beam, Explosion, Self-Destruct, and the gimmicky 2-turn Sky Attack, but it also had high accuracy and a 30% chance to effectively instant kill the target. This was truly a Blizzard from hell. In fact, Blizzard was quickly identified to be so utterly broken that it was nerfed for the international release. Red and Blue reduced the freeze chance to 10%, though the move's power and accuracy remained intact for the time being, turning it from game-breaking to still the best move in the game. The immense danger of Freeze explains the oddly poor offensive stat spreads of Gen 1 Ice Pokemon. They didn't need it. They effectively had a set of reliable, high damage moves, which also had a chance to instantly kill for free. Compared to Psychic types, which had high special stats but merely quote-unquote a 90 base power attack, Blizzard's much higher overall base power, freeze chance, and the Ice type's 4 offensive advantages helped compensate for their otherwise lower offense stats. At least in theory. We all know what happened in practice. At any rate, a fast freeze was likely something the designers were wary of, so the Ice types got designed around bulk, giving the opponent a chance to hit them at least once. With their pot Water type and solid defenses and HP, Dewgong and Lapras could effectively just sit around, not die, and fish for freeze while outputting decently high damage. Cloyster had high defenses and the trapping move Clamp, allowing it to stall in an admittedly different way. Also, Articuno was the overall slowest and bulkiest of the 3 legendary birds. The only exception was Jinx. who had mediocre bulk but good speed and utility, and benefited from being a psychic type. Though considering its signature move was Lovely Kiss, which was a high accuracy sleep move, it seems that being a fast disabler was likely Jinx's intended gameplay design. Now, this all makes for a compelling case for why Ice attacks are great. So I'm sure many of you are thinking, what if I just use ice moves on another Pokemon? And to that, I would focus on the if part of that statement. Because the only non-ice Pokemon which learned any attacking ice moves via level up was Hitmonchan, who got Ice Punch for its Wimpy 35 special stat. So the only way you'd get them is through TMs, and you only get one of each. Ice Beam and Blizzard were TMs located in easily missable locations. Ice Beam was obtained in Celadon City and required you to buy drinks for this NPC girl, making it a reward for interacting with NPCs and solving a not exactly obvious overworld puzzle. Whereas Blizzard was located in Cinnabar Island's mansion, making it a reward for dungeon exploration. And it is indeed very missable. The Cinnabar Gym Key is located over here, whereas the Blizzard TM is located over here in a completely separate room. Getting it requires the player to fiddle around with the statue switches, so there's no guarantee that every player will pick it up. This is notably a very different treatment from the Solar Beam TM, which was located right here, right next to the secret key, and is thus impossible to miss. With both Ice TMs being hidden behind optional exploration, it was very likely that many players never got to use them. And even if they did, they only had one chance each, so they had to use it wisely. In contrast, every Ice-type Pokemon naturally learns Ice attacks via level up. So if you want an Ice attack, Ice Pokemon are really the most accessible source. You even get a free Lapras from the NPC in the Sylph Company room where you battle Blue, conveniently at the point you'd be needing a Surf user for the next badge. In fact, TM was the only way you'd expect to get Blizzard at all, because the only Pokemon which gets it via level up is Articuno. The only way you'd get to put Blizzard on multiple Pokemon was if you played Showdown and other battle simulators, or did a lot of trading, neither of which needed to be considered during the original game's design. As befitting its glass cannon potential, Ice was a type handled with absolute caution in Gen 1. The moves were powerful, but exclusive and hard to find. The Pokemon were great, but hardly overpowered. And while Freeze was undeniably busted, it was held in check by low activation chances and only being found on 3 moves in the game. Ice was genuinely good, but within the context of a Generation 1 playthrough, overall fairly balanced. It was more than deserving of its position as an Elite 4 type. In fact, Ice was considered so good that Lorelei, despite being the first Elite 4 member, was the one who saw the fewest number of moveset changes between the original games and Yellow, with her Lapras and Jinx going completely unchanged. A far cry from Agatha and Lance, who needed their entire team's movesets overhauled. Then in Gen 2, Ice got nerfed into the ground so brutally you'd think Kanto got hit with climate change. This was the tipping point when Ice started developing the reputation for being hot garbage, which it still carries to this very day. Seriously, everybody talks about how badly Psychic was nerfed, but in my opinion, Ice arguably got hit way worse. Freeze got reworked to give the frozen target a 10% chance to thaw each turn, which was later changed to 20% in the 3rd generation. This turned Freeze into a Sleep side grade, being RNG chance-based as opposed to Sleep's fixed counter system. However, unlike Sleep, Freeze retained all the original limitations of low activation chances and having much fewer moves capable of inflicting it, making it far worse. Like Psychic, Ice was also nerfed by the type rebalancing, with the newly added Steel type resisting ice attacks and being able to hit ice for super effective damage. Fire was also buffed to resist ice attacks, making it both offensively and defensively advantaged over ice. So the glass cannon became more glass and less cannon. All Gen 1 Ice Pokemon were effectively nerfed in different ways, by the special stat being divided into special attack and special defense. Cloyster now had 40 less special defense. Dugong had 20 less special attack. Lapras had 10 less special attack, and Articuno had 30 less special attack. All of this just blunted the cannon even further. Though on the upside, Cloyster got spikes, so Cloyster investors walked away with a win there. The only one who went through completely unscathed was Jinx, who actually gained 20 extra special attack. Also a baby pre-evolution for some reason. Why?
Pecking order.
And what useful changes did the type receive in return for all of this? Well, nothing. It didn't get anything. Powder Snow was a useful early game addition, except there were still no early game ice Pokemon. Every ice type was only accessible after the 7th badge. Maybe you could get Smoochum if you were lucky with a free egg, but that was it. Icy Wind was a nifty utility tool, but it was largely useless at the time because it had low base power and many ice Pokemon would rather do other things besides debuff speed. Both moves would later see more relevance in the future. Powder Snow because ice types were gradually introduced at earlier points as playable Pokemon and enemies, and Icy Wind because doubles got invented, but at the time they didn't do a lot to advance the type. New ice Pokemon were introduced, both of which had great potential, which was completely wasted in impressively appalling ways. Piloswine's Ice Ground type is one of the best offensive combinations in all of Pokemon, even today. The two types have perfect offensive synergy. Ground is able to hit everything that resists ice and vice versa. The trade-off is that this combination only resisted one type, being poison, but that's still more than fair for a glass cannon. Except Piloswine wasn't that. Piloswine had 60 special attack, meaning its ice moves were as damaging as mild air conditioning. And its 100 attack Earthquake was good, but not amazing. For reference, Sand Slash had 100 attack. Donphan had 120 attack. Piloswine had the stats of a slow tank with mediocre mixed offenses. This is the worst possible stat spread you could hope to pair with this type combination. It fails to take advantage of all the benefits and tries to build around all the weaknesses. Also, let's not give it any ground moves except via TM. Meanwhile, we have Sneasel, who rocks up with a textbook perfect definition of a glass cannon stat spread. Look at this. High attack, non-existent defenses, a great offensive type combo, and an incredible 115 speed. Sneasel's stat line is brilliantly min-maxed to perfection. Except Dark and Ice dealt damage based on special attack, meaning Sneasel's stabs use its pathetic 35 special attack instead of its actually good 95 attack. Also, let's not give it any ice moves except via TM. Also, let's make its best dark move Feint Attack. Also, let's make it only available at Mount Silver, the final area of the entire game. Why are we still here? Just to suffer? Perhaps all of this was an intentional choice to restrict Ice, because at the time, it was still the designated dragon slaying type, and the Johto games, notably, had a champion specializing in flying types, but loves to tell everybody he's technically a dragon user because half his team is the same Pokemon. However, this didn't change the fact that Ice was still awful. At this point, you could arguably make a case for Ice being the worst type in all of Gen 2, even more than Bug and Poison. At least those types saw improvements in moves and Pokemon. Ice just got worse in every possible way. I will unironically state that the most impactful new Ice Pokemon in Gen 2 was Delibird, because it actually succeeded at its job. Delibird was added solely for the purpose of marketing, and by Christmas it was good at marketing. Generation 3 is when Ice evolved, in the opposite direction. This was the point when the type's identity of slow, bulky ice type started to properly take shape and establish itself. Gen 3 introduced weather conditions, with Hail being the weather for ice types. Hail dealt chip damage to non-ice type Pokemon every turn, which in theory would allow for some defensive stalling playstyle, with ice Pokemon using Hail to rack up damage over time while still packing a decent punch with ice attacks. The Pokemon also leaned into the bulky approach very heavily. In practice, slow, bulky ice type sort of worked, though Hail itself saw niche use since the opportunity cost of bringing it and spending a turn to use the move was questionable. The previous generation's ice types stayed mostly the same, but Walrein and Regice were legitimately great Pokemon, having a good mix of offense to complement their huge bulk. Walrein had a great bulky stat spread, not dissimilar from Lapras, and the new legendary, Regice, was an incredibly min-max special tank, boasting a mind-numbing 200 special defense stat and a surprisingly respectable 100 special attack, which was, amusingly enough, the highest special attack out of all ice types in the 3rd generation. Meanwhile, Glalie and its love for the 80s were off trying to do its best disco ball impression in a corner somewhere. Unfortunately, Hoenn's ice Pokemon were still only accessible at a very late stage of the game, at the 7th badge. The earliest you could get an ice type is the Weather Institute with Hail Mode cast form, which is depressing for multiple reasons. At least they can help against Winona's Altaria. The developers evidently still believed ice to be an advanced enough concept that it shouldn't be available early. Still, at least the new ice Pokemon made for genuinely good late-game additions to any in-game playthrough, especially considering what we had to work with in the last generation. As for the other move additions, Ice Ball was a rollout reskin. Thankfully, no Ice Miltank. Sheer Cold will later go on to cause grief for many tournament players for years to come, which I personally find hilarious. And Icicle Spear got added just for Cloyster. Good for you, Cloyster. Fortunately, Gen 4 was the point when Game Freak realized they no longer needed to be so restrained about the ice type, and their changed design philosophy finally allowed the ice type to be the glass cannon it was always intended to be. Generation 4 introduced 6 new ice Pokemon, all of whom had perfectly allocated stat spreads and diverse respective roles. Mamoswine and Weavile were major evolutions to the previously flawed Piloswine and Sneasel, and the generation's changes fixed practically every problem they previously had. They both received much more attack, much more speed, and could actually use their respective offensive stabs to their fullest potential thanks to the physical special split, which made physical ice and dark moves an actual thing. Both were also gifted the new Ice Shard move, a 4E base power priority attack. And out of all types, Ice absolutely needed a priority move above all else. Ice Fang and Avalanche also served as additional physical ice options, which were useful as coverage and for slow Pokemon respectively. Frostlass arrived as an alternative evolution for Snorunt with a useful ice ghost typing, and showed Glalie what it could have been if it stopped screwing around with 80 and allocated its stats a bit better, with an excellent 110 speed and move pool making it a useful utility support. Glaceon was the new evolution on the block, and broke the ceiling for ice damage with an incredible 130 special attack. Refrigerators got invented. Finally, to cap off everything, we have probably one of the most iconic ice Pokemon ever created, the living Christmas tree, Abomasnow. At first glance, Abomasnow appeared to be built similar to a worse Piloswine, having a similar bulky stat line, but with an actual special attack stat, and a typing which gets hit super effectively by everything under the sun, especially the sun. However, unlike Piloswine, Abomasnow had a trick up its non-existent sleeves: Snow Warning. Some of the biggest improvements to Ice came in the form of numerous hail-related upgrades, and Abomasnow was the biggest beneficiary of all of these, as its Snow Warning allowed it to summon hail on switch-in. And just like Sandstream and unlike Drought and Drizzle, Snow Warning was highly accessible due to not being locked to a legendary. Accompanying it were Ice Body and Snow Cloak, two abilities which greatly benefited both the bulky and glass cannon styles of ice types perfectly. The former allowed Walrein to actually become a viable stall tank, with the famous Stallrein set being the most successful any ice type has ever been at stalling. and the latter allowed Frostlass to survive far longer than it had any right to. Of course, the actual change which people cared about was the big Blizzard buff. While Hail is active, Blizzard is now guaranteed to hit the target, bypassing all accuracy checks. This change added a whole new offensive dimension to Hail as a playstyle. Now, instead of just being solely used to attempt a stall or cancel out a more dangerous weather, it served to enable a player to freely abuse the high power of Blizzard without any drawback, which indirectly helped turn Abomasnow into more of a glass cannon than what its stats would imply, letting it output far more damage than what its 92 special attack would ordinarily be capable of. This was Ice's peak. After 3 generations, its full potential has finally been realized. Ice was no longer a potential man. The next few generations didn't add anything exceptionally noteworthy. As with every other type, new ice moves, Pokemon, and abilities were added, all of which had varying degrees of usefulness. But there weren't many major direct changes to the type itself. However, one thing that did change was the environment of the game and the overall design philosophy. In the past, Pokemon were generally fairly restrained regarding their stats and move pools. They had few options beyond their stabs due to TMs being single use, and any stat above 100 was generally considered pretty high. But over time, this changed. Gen 5 made all TMs reusable, meaning suddenly every Pokemon in every playthrough, player and opponent alike, began sporting all sorts of wacky coverage options which they never have used before. This had severe consequences for the Ice type. Ice Pokemon lost their exclusive access to Ice moves. While they still retain Stab, their ability to naturally access Ice moves via level up was now unimportant, because all other Pokemon could now freely learn Ice moves once you find the respective TM. The opportunity cost of using TMs was completely removed. In the past, you'd need to think twice before giving that Ice Beam TM to someone, but now you can just give it to your whole team once you get it. This is what solidified the sentiment that Ice Pokemon were useless and unnecessary, because you no longer needed to actually use Ice Pokemon to use Ice moves. Just teach Ice Beam to every water type you have. This has always been the case for competitive scenarios and simulators, but that only ever concerned a small portion of players. Gen 5's TM changes made this the case for the mainline game experience too, which affected the entire player base. Also, the power level of Pokemon slowly began increasing, with new Pokemon sporting more min-max stat lines which were more damaging, more bulky, and more speedy than before. This impacted all older Pokemon in general, but Ice types were hurt especially bad because they had so many weaknesses. In the past, bulky Ice types were able to work because they had the stats to tank neutral hits, which let them tank opponents which lacked super effective coverage. But now everyone has access to super effective coverage all the time. Between 4 possible move slots and a big pocket full of TMs, it's quite rare to have your Pokemon not have some way to hit an Ice type super effectively. This meant bulky Ice types had to tank ever greater amounts of damage, much of which is super effective and thus doubled, with practically no resistances to help it. Meanwhile, offensive Ice types found themselves having to contend with increasingly bulky walls who could tank their hits and hit back hard. In both cases, the margin of error for Ice Pokemon was now much lower than before. The slow, bulky Ice type era of viability was over, melted away. X and Y even introduced Avalugg, which had the perfect stat line and move pool to be a dedicated physical tank. And it wasn't even any good at that. Aurora Veil was even added as a new screen type in an attempt to improve the former defensive Hail playstyle, but it wasn't enough. It was becoming increasingly clear that for an Ice type to be good in this modern era, it needed to focus on the Glass Cannon playstyle. They needed to be either really fast or hit really hard. Ideally both, like Darmanitan. More than any other type, the Ice type's viability hinged on the speed stat. Ice Pokemon needed to be either naturally fast or have some means of becoming fast, either through stat boosting like Cloyster's Shell Smash, or an ability like Galarian Darmanitan's Zen Mode. In general, regardless of whether they are sweeping, revenge killing, or providing support, it's fairly rare to have an Ice type which is actually fast and not at least decent in some way. This, once again, goes back to the core principle of a glass cannon. Hit hard while not getting hit. And in Pokemon, the best way to not get hit is to move first and KO the opponent. The best defense is a good offense is a phrase which many Ice Pokemon live and die by. Of course, that's not to say that slow Ice types were not viable, it's just that their approach shifted away from defensive playstyles to being slow nukes with wall-crushing levels of power, such as with Glastrier and Calyrex or Baxcalibur. They were slow and bulky, yes, but that bulk was secondary to their offensive power, and was mostly there to help them endure a few hits while they smashed through their opponents. A very far cry from the stall reign of ages past. These Pokemon would typically be equipped with choice items to bolster their power even further, and receive additional team support such as Trick Room or Tailwind or Icy Wind to aid in their speed issues. This should be how the Song of Ice and No Fire ends, a story of the glass cannon type on its bizarre adventure across the years, experimenting with a new archetype along the way before finally returning to the glass cannon playstyle as per its original design. Except it didn't. Legends Arceus brought an unexpected change to the Ice type by introducing the Snow weather condition, which subsequently replaced Hail as of Scarlet and Violet. All items, abilities, and move interactions which previously involved Hail were changed to utilize Snow, and the move was removed from the game entirely, being replaced by the Snowscape TM. Unlike Hail, Snow does not inflict chip damage. Instead, it boosts the defense of Ice Pokemon by 50%, basically trading out one half of Sandstorm's effect for the other half. While this new effect is much simpler, it had a huge impact on the viability of defensive Ice types. As it turns out, a free 50% defense boost was a pretty big deal when stacked on top of all the additional defensive focused designs from previous generations, and effectively helped neutralize the damage from a super effective hit. You could very viably run a Snow team with Aurora Veil and Snow Cloak and end up being both deceptively hard to kill while still retaining high damage output thanks to Blizzard. In fact, Snow Cloak Articuno became a sleeper hit in VGC for this exact reason, being evasive, bulky, having good damage output, and also sneaking in the occasional sheer cold. Ice and Snow's capture accessibility in this generation was also much more relaxed. While Glaciadio Mountain is still the location of the 7th and 8th badges, the game's open-world nature allowed many players to access that area earlier than usual if they decide to. If a player really wants to get a Sotado before the 3rd gym, they are more than welcome to cross the whole region to do so. Many of the generation's new Pokemon have also struck a solid balance between bulk and speed while maintaining huge offensive power. Baxcalibur has a huge attack stat, an ability which boosts it further, and access to speed boosting in Dragon Dance. Cetitan packs a gigantic 170 HP, great 113 attack, decent 73 speed, and 3 abilities which allow it to gain extra bulk, speed, or offenses respectively. And Tianbao is basically Weavile 2, made in China edition. And then there is Iron Bundle. Apparently, in the grimdark future of the 41st millennium, there is still Christmas. It's still too early to tell how truly impactful these snow changes will be for Ice-type Pokemon moving forward, but one thing is for sure, the future of the Ice-type looks to be a positive one. It's just like a bright Christmas morning. So, my dear viewer, what's your favorite Ice-type Pokemon, and why do you love it so? Feel free to gush about your favorite Ice-type Pokemon in the comments, and let me know which type you'd like to hear me talk about next. Till next time everyone, wishing you all a Merry Christmas and a Happy Holidays.